Good morning, everyone. Good time of the day. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. It is about the updated and final second report of the panel of experts on resource mobilization, providing an assessment of the financial needs to implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So before we hear from the panel, from one of the eminent authors of another assessment studies that was referenced in the report, and for a number of other speakers, I would like to give the floor to Charlotta Sökvist from Sweden, the chair of the subsidiary body on implementation, to provide a few opening remarks. Charlotta, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Marcus. Dear presenters, dear colleagues, dear friends, good time of a day to all of you. I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar where the panel of experts will update us on their work on one of the tasks on their agenda, namely the estimation of resources needed for implementing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. You will recall that COP14 affirmed that resource mobilization would be an integral part of a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The COP decided to initiate preparations of this resource mobilization component at an early stage and in full coherence and coordination with the overall process of developing the post-2020 framework. In order to support the work, the COP tasked a panel of experts to prepare reports on resource mobilization to contribute to the overall process. These reports were already issued for the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation. However, the second report on the estimation of resources needed for the implementation of a post-2020 global biodiversity framework in preliminary form. Today, we are going to hear about the updated and final second report of the panel. Presenters will provide a broader discussion on the different estimates and more background information on the underlying methodologies. They will also position this report in the broader work of the expert panel. As you know, both the open-ended working group and the SPI already embarked on a discussion on resource mobilization at the first phase of their meetings. As we expect to move to a negotiation stage at the resumed session next year, I trust that this final report and our discussion today will be useful for the process ahead. I am pleased to welcome the expert panel, Mr. Jascha Pfefferholz from the EcoHealth Alliance, Ms. Tracy Cummings from the Republic of South Africa, and Mr. Jeremy Eppels from the United Kingdom. And I'm also pleased to welcome Professor Tobin from Cornell University, the main author of one of the important studies reflected in the panel's report. I also look forward to hear the reflections of Mr. Frans Ogwell and Basil van Haab, the co-chairs of a post-2020 process, as well as to the comments and questions from all of you. Without further ado, let me now hand back. I look forward to the fruitful discussions in the next hour and a half. Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, Charlotta, for these remarks. And equally, without further ado, I would like now to pass the floor to Jascha to provide his presentation on the final report. Jascha, floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Charlotta. Let me share my screen. Hopefully, everybody can see the screen. First of all, I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. I think we've been working really hard on this report and all the reports with Jeremy and Tracy. And
Jascha, if I may, can you switch it into presentation mode still?
I did. You.
Or maybe that's delayed then. Yeah.
It says paused. Let me maybe. Now? No. Sorry, this is. Can you see my presentation?
Sometimes it is a bit slow. No, your presentation disappeared. Maybe give it another try. Yeah, excellent.
I'm so sorry. What are you? So I click share and now I see myself. Do you see the presentation?
I see it on my screen.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Again, Marcus, thank you, Charlotta. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar. I'm trying to solve this. Hopefully you, please let me know if you see the screen with the PowerPoint. If not, I'll try to fix it. So I was saying that we worked really hard in trying to during this report with Jeremy and Tracy. Hopefully you'll have time to read the report. This is a small presentation of all the topics that we touched in the report, but I think it could be much more fruitful for you look at the report and look at the all the results that we show in there. So as Carlota said, we in the 14th meeting, there was tasked a panel of experts on resource mobilization, and I'm gonna, is this okay? And the task was consisted on to estimate the resources from all sources needed for different scenarios of the implementation of the post-2020 framework, taking into account the needs assessment of the global environmental facility, as well as costs and benefits arising from the implementation of the post-2020 framework. So as you can see, there are three things here, and this report concentrates on these three topics. One is estimation of resources from all sources. Second, try to understand the cost and benefits arising from the implementation, and including in this assessment, the assessment from the global environmental facility. So these reports include first, review the potential costs and benefits arising from biodiversity conservation and sustainable use based on different scenarios. And I'm gonna go through all these different methodologies. Second, overview of analysis underlying methodologies and resulting estimates of the fund needed for the implementation of a post-2020 framework, and some elements of this framework, especially on protected areas. We are not trying to estimate the cost of the new framework, and this is really important. We try to show different methodologies and try to show different works that have been done in terms of understanding the funds needed for the implementation. And third, we're going to focus our discussion on the differences in methodologies and the main conclusions about the JEF assessment and key messages. So getting directly into the cost and benefits arising from biodiversity conservation, I'll show you the results of three important reports. We concentrate our effort in these three reports because I think these reports show what we believe are the most significant numbers in terms of global numbers, and also in terms of on understanding what do we need to understand on cost benefits for biodiversity only and not for other types of conservation.
So sorry to interrupt, it's Jeremy, but we can still only see your title slide, I'm afraid. I think you have to use the arrows in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture of the titles, right? Not the left and right arrows on the keyboard usually. You have to do it on the screen. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it would help.
What do you see now? I'm sorry, but I see my presentation, and that's why I keep going.
I don't know about others. I only see your title slide.
I'm not seeing. Hello, I'm not seeing anything moving. Francis here. Actually, when I started talking, I thought you were giving preamble that you are not yet started on the slides. So your slide is not.
Can you see my slides moving from one slide to another right now?
Only the first one, and it's stuck.
No, we can't.
I think someone. I think. Yeah, thank you for letting me know, because for me, I'm changing the presentation, and in the control panel it says pause, and so I really don't know if someone can. I'm clicking on showing presentation, showing pause Microsoft.
When you click on show presentation, in the bottom left-hand corner of each slide, do you see some grey left and right arrows and a pencil? And do you see that in the actual?
Yeah. But I'm moving around. I'm moving the slides with those arrows, and
you are okay, right?
I think. Give me 1 second. So now you see me and Marcus. I'm gonna show the presentation again, but every time I show the presentation, it says pause. It doesn't allow me to move from one slide to another one.
Yeah, sure. It's Tracy here. Mariana has a comment saying maybe try without full screen. So if we don't see it in presentation mode, we just see you flipping through your active screen. That might work. It's not ideal, but it's a good workaround.
Let's see. Can you? Yeah, that's a good one. Can you see now? I'm moving around the slides.
No. No, we can't see your screen at all now.
Okay, I'm gonna try something different. I'm sorry. Main screen.
Okay, we can see your.
You see it now. You see it now. Excellent.
Yeah.
I think I shared. Yeah, I'm just showing the main screen now.
So rather do it this way.
I'm so sorry, but I think I can continue.
Now it's moving. Now it's working.
Now it's moving. I needed to show the main screen instead of just the PowerPoint, and I think now it's working.
Great, go for it.
Like I said, I'm gonna talk about a little bit. I'm gonna try to go a little bit faster in this part of the presentation to get the main part. But as I said, I want to show you 3 reports that are really important in terms of understanding the cost and benefits from biodiversity conservation. They are all global, and they all try to understand the benefits of doing certain actions and the cost, of course, but they focus in different methodologies. So the first one is the Global Future Report, and this report, it's a report that concentrates on estimation of ecosystem services. They try to look at 6 different ecosystem services, and they try to see in different scenarios what would happen if we keep doing what we are doing compared to moving to a more conservation action. What they found is that in general, if we keep doing what we are doing right now, we will have cumulative losses for the economy of around $10 trillion. This is the cumulative loss. If we think in terms of annual losses, we are talking about 500 billion, 479 billion annually, which if we put it in terms of GDP, global GDP, we are talking around 0.67% of annual GDP. If we think of the most conservation scenario, we move from all these scenarios from not doing anything to doing as much as we can in terms of conservation, we find that we move from losing 10 trillions to gaining in the sense of the economy $230 billion per year cumulative, or around 11 billion annually, which is 0.02% of global GDP. So I think the interesting about this report is that it's global. It tries to look at the most known ecosystem services. it uses a methodology that it's based on GTAP, which is economic modeling that is very well known, and it tries to create these scenarios where we compare a most ambitious scenario with a very actual scenario, and see that if we move from not doing anything to conservation, we can gain, and these gains are real in terms of the economy. They are not something that we get, like, it's not something that it's just fictitious. It's actual real gains for the economy in terms of prices and welfare. The other report that I want to show you, let me see if I can move here. The other report is, I think, one of the most important reports that are included in all these analyses, and it's a report by Anthony Waldron and Cambridge University and Campaign for Nature. It's called Protecting 30% of the Planet for Nature, Costs, Benefits, and Economic Implications. They concentrate, instead of concentrated on ecosystem services or just global, they concentrate on the benefits and costs of expanding protected areas from what we have now to 30% into the future by 2030. I think the interesting about this report, and you can read our report that shows all the details, it's that they find that in any of the scenarios there is net global benefits. That means that either we move from very little conservation to a huge amount of conservation that includes 30% of protected areas, and in all these scenarios we find that it's economically efficient to expand protected areas. Again, one of the assumptions of this report is that you have benefits from revenues, from creating more revenues into the future in terms of tourism, agriculture, and fisheries that they are sustainable, but also avoided annual losses. And these numbers are between 100 and 200 and 312 for revenues, and between 150 to 210 in terms of avoided annual losses. The other interesting about this analysis is that the investment needed is much lower than all the benefits that produce. So when you think in terms of benefits minus cost, you get these net benefits global, and they tend to always be positive. So moving on, the third report that we included in this analysis is the Dasgupta review. I think there's something very important to say about what they are saying, and basically what they are saying is that we have a portfolio asset management problem. We've been managing our assets wrongly for a long time because we are not considering nature as an asset. We are thinking about capital and physical, human capital and physical capital, and we are spending too much into increasing capital in terms of human and physical, but not in conserving nature. So I think this is a very interesting way of thinking, a methodology of thinking about conservation that I think it's important to include in this analysis. They show that the stock of natural capital have declined 40%, while human capital increased only 13%. So you can think in terms of we've been mismanaged our portfolio of assets. And the reason, one of the important reasons why this has happened is because governments around the world are paying more to people to exploit nature than to protect it. They show how subsidies, like the cost of subsidies in terms of damages for nature are around 4 to 6 trillion per year. And if we don't do something now, of course, we are going to have to pay much. The damages are going to be much higher in the future, and we're going to have to pay more in the future to protect biodiversity. So as you can see, we included only these 3 reports. I think we looked at much more other reports, but I think these are the 3 ones that show actually what we are thinking in terms of globally, in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of understanding benefits and costs. So I think from biodiversity conservation. When I think this is the most important part of our presentation, and I think everybody is like expecting this to talk about the estimates of the fund needed for the implementation. In this section, we included 4 analyses. One is the other section of the Campaign for Nature and National Geographic done by Professor Waldron, which is protecting 30% of marine and land areas. We are going to talk about financing nature. I think we're going to try to also talk a little bit about the differences in the methodologies in this report. And we're going to include also another report by the United Nations Environmental Programme, which complements the other reports, which is not exactly on biodiversity, but it allows you to see the magnitudes of numbers that we are talking. And in the end, I'll show you that we also did our analysis that is included in this report, and how this analysis compare, that it's based on NBSAPs, and how this analysis compare with the other analysis. So when we looked at protecting 30% of land and marine areas, as I said before, we were looking at always benefits. The funding needed to protect 30% of the planet goes around $103 billion to $178 billion. The way that they estimated these numbers are using maps. So they use maps that they linked to economic models, of integrated economic models, and they try to create scenarios to understand what would happen if we try to conserve more and more and more. And in the end, they had this range of funding that goes from 103 and 178 billions, which we can think in terms of 4 to 7 times current levels of investment in protected areas. I think it's important that that we separate this funding in terms of current funding to manage current protected areas and funding for new protected areas. And you can see that in general, we think that 60 to 70 billions are for managing current protected areas, and there's a range between 35 to 110 billions that go to new additional protected areas. These numbers do not include compensation cost, and I think this is something that I'll talk in 2 slides more. But I think it's a really important concept that we need to discuss. When we talk about compensation costs, we are talking about the amount of resources that we are giving to someone to create an incentive. And that incentive is to change the action that they are doing. In this case in particular, when we are talking about protected areas, we are thinking about compensating people from whatever activity they are doing in that area to transform that area into a protected area. And it's important to separate because these costs are relatively large, usually when we include them. And so it's in terms of looking at the big picture, it's better to think in looking at them separately or together with all the other financial needs. So I always talk about thinking in terms of financial needs and economic needs. And a little bit what we are saying is that one includes compensation cost, economic needs, and the other one doesn't. The Financing Nature report, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap, looked at economic activities, looked at resources needed to achieve plan of conservation by 2030 for 6 activities. What are these 6 activities? One is protecting 30% of the land, which they based this part of the activity on what the other report, the Campaign for Nature and National Geographic did. They talked about transforming 3 economic sectors, agricultural, fisheries, and forestry, into sustainable sectors in a range of 3 to 4 years, conserving coastal ecosystem, conserving urban environments, continuous management of invasive species, and water quality protection for urban areas. the results they get is that funding needed is around 700 to 900 billion annually. When we looked at what's being spent right now, there's a financial gap. This finance gap is between 600 to 800 billion annually, with a mean of 700 billions. The interesting about this report is that it looks at each sector separately. It includes compensation costs, which are a not small proportion of these numbers. And I think in general, they do a good work in terms of looking at each one of them separately. I think I'm going to try to compare this a little bit in the next slide with what we came up with in terms of financial needs. I'll try to explain to you the differences and see if we can discuss when we talked about compensation cost or we talked about the different definitions of resources needed. Before I go into that, there's also we included this report on investment needed based on nature-based solutions. This report, I think it's important because it's a very well done reporting in terms of economics. They use a very state-of-the-art economic model to estimate investments on nature-based solutions, but they focus their attention on the three Rio conventions: meet climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation global targets. They found that there is a need of additional 403 billion annual investments to basically three targets. One, limit the increase of global mean temperature to 2 Celsius, lower the carbon emissions, and of course, lower the rate of loss of biodiversity by 2050. The negative about in terms of our report for this work is that it's not possible to separate the proportion targeting only biodiversity. This is a number that gives a sense of the funding needed, additional funding needed in terms of the three Rio conventions, and I think it's important to use it as a comparison, but it's not a number that allows us to focus only on biodiversity. And finally, we did some analysis in terms of funding needed that it's based on NBSAPs. We collected data from the financial report framework of the convention. We used that data together with country characteristics to extrapolate domestic expenditures and financial needs from all the countries in the convention. And we used that extrapolation to estimate financial needs as a global. We found that around, like a very average number, that it's around 180 billion annually, which is 2 to 4 times current levels. The interesting or the disadvantage of this work is that it's a very conservative projection. The compensation cost that I was talking on the other reports, it's included in this report as long as it's included on the numbers that we're reporting on the financial framework. And if we think that we are talking about a new framework and we are thinking about future numbers, somehow this becomes very conservative because we are thinking only in terms of past information and not future information. And past information doesn't include this ambition on the new framework. So the way I think about this is I separated a little bit this comparison to understand why we have these big differences numbers, which I don't think first, I don't think they're so big. Second, I don't think the methodologies are different. Ones are based on activities. They think about compensation costs, which are important, and the estimation based on NBSAPs are much smaller because they are based on past numbers, and also because they don't think they don't try to estimate this compensation cost. So the way that I wanted to explain this it's if you look at this graph and you look at the right side, you can see that there are economic needs around 850 billions, which are separated by activities. So conservation of croplands, transforming croplands into a sustainable system. The same for rangeland, protecting areas, which are 100 to 170 billion from the other works. Also transforming urban environments and invasive species, and so on. And so you have economic needs for 850 billions. And when I say economic, I'm referring specifically as the sum of financial needs with compensation cost. Now, if we separate this in terms of in financial and compensation, we can think in very rough numbers of 400 billions that are financial and 450 billions that are compensation costs, which are these costs, as I said, that they compensate the economic activity to create an incentive to transform. And the question for me comes from understanding how big these compensation costs need to be. If we compare this, we look at not the compensation cost, our numbers in terms of NBSAPs are much smaller, as I said, on the left side, and we can think of that difference between the 400 and the 880 billions as activities not reflected in NBSAPs. That could be that ambition in terms of financial needs. But again, we have this gap that, so we can separate this kind of like in compensation costs, in financial needs, and somehow these financial needs that are not reflected in the current NBSAPs, but we expect that they will be reflected in future NBSAPs. And so so that's kind of like I think it's an important conversation, just to finish this graph, because these compensation costs are not something that are irrelevant in terms of estimation of the total economic needs that we are thinking about for the new framework. As I said, we did a lot of work in terms of the GEF 8 assessment. We looked at national reports, NBSAPs, financial reports, biopin interviews, previous reports, and we concentrated on creating a questionnaire that collects information about future projects for all the parties that receive funding from the GEF. In the end, we finished this very recently, and in the end, we collected information on 44 countries, which is around 30% of the countries that receive funding. They reported 210 projects with a value of $4.1 billion. And they reported that around 32% expected to be funded by GEF. We created 3 scenarios. These are projections, based on some of them based on the questionnaire, some of them not based on the questionnaire. The scenario 1, which is not a really relevant scenario, which we included in the report because we wanted to at least compare with something from the questionnaire, which we believe is much more relevant than not using the questionnaire. So we just looked at the difference between the GEF 6 and the GEF 7 star allocation, which of course it's nothing to do with the new framework. So it's not relevant, but like as I said, we included, and we look at the difference, and then we use that difference to calculate a projection for the future in terms of the difference between GEF 6 and GEF 7, starting from GEF 7 to GEF 8. The second scenario, I think it's much more realistic in terms of looking at each one of the countries that responded the questionnaire. We compare how much they are expecting in allocation on the next cycle, the GEF 7, compared with what it was allocated in the star allocation in GEF 7, compared with GEF 8. We calculate the average percentage difference between all the countries, and then we use that average to estimate what would be the allocation for countries that did not respond to the questionnaire. The third scenario, which I think it's the most relevant in terms of really understanding projections, we use a statistical analysis And again, we use each country information and country characteristics to predict what would be the funding needed for countries that did not respond to the questionnaire, and then we sum up that to come up with projection of what are the funding for the GEF. So the first scenario, which I think, like I said, it's irrelevant for the new framework. We estimated $1.6 billion for the GEF assessment, for the GEF allocation. The second scenario, this says scenario 2 and 1, but it's upside down. But the second scenario estimated 2.7 billion for allocation, and the third one, which I think it uses the best information we have in terms of the questionnaire and country characteristics. It came up with 3.7 billion allocation, and this is only for biodiversity. We are not including, of course, any other type of funding that is not related with biodiversity. To finish my presentation, and I think I've spent much more time than I needed, I want you to leave you with some key messages from the report. And again, I recommend you to look at the report, which has much more details. The first key message that we came up is that current levels of ambitions of resources is not sufficient. Of course, the resources have been less than what we needed, which created inefficiently in how we manage nature and how we compare these assets with other assets. So we need to raise more resources, and I think we all agree that that's necessary at this point. But also, this is a compelling economic argument. This allocation will have returns, positive returns, and there is a clear economic argument in favor of allocating more resources. The benefits of allocating resources are higher than the cost. Each dollar we spend in allocation, the benefits for the society, for the world, is much higher than the costs, and that can be translated into returns on investment. We see that if we spend now this money, this funding into conservation of biodiversity, we'll see that as we move into the future, we will need less resources compared to today. That doesn't mean that it's not compared to that point in the future, but we will need less resources if we have higher conservations today. As a final point, I think it's important to say that not all regions reap the same benefits, not incur the same opportunity cost from increasing investments in conservation. I think we need to spend more efforts, and this is not necessarily an effort that we spend on this report, but we need to concentrate efforts on understanding the mechanisms and distribution of this funding, especially thinking about who gets the benefits and who assumes the cost of this funding, and thinking in terms of countries that usually gets more benefits and countries that get less benefits but assume the cost of the conservation and not necessarily receive all the funding needed from those costs. And with that, I'm finishing my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jascha, for this overview of the latest and final report. Let's now hear from John Tobin complementing your presentation specifically on the work they did for TNC and the Paulson Institute. John, are you there? Would you be able to start?
All right. Hopefully you see me. Do you?
I see you very well.
And can you hear me?
Also.
Terrific. All right then. Well, first of all, many thanks to the organizers and friends at the CBD Secretariat for asking me to join this event. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to share a few thoughts on the methodology used in the report we're discussing today in the context of and compared with some of the other estimates that we've seen in the past. Of course, going into the detailed methodology of this report and how it is similar and how it might be different from some of the other publications that we have seen over the course of the past decade or so, it could take our entire session and more. And Yasha has already highlighted in detail some of those differences. But there are a few things that are worth pointing out. But I would rather focus on really on the lessons that we can derive from looking at these various studies and methodologies and try to draw some at least preliminary conclusions about what we're looking at. So which are some of these reports and methodologies that I'm alluding to and that Yasha has mentioned? Well, we've already heard from Yasha about several of them, but I also want to mention a few others that you may be familiar with. You may have come across, for example, the Little Biodiversity Finance book, which was published by Global Canopy just over a decade ago. This got quite a bit of discussion going at that time about what the right level of expenditure would eventually be if we are to sustainably manage biodiversity for the long term. A little bit more recently, there were a couple of reports entitled Conservation Finance that were published in 2014 and 2016 by Credit Suisse and McKinsey in collaboration with WWF and some other partners. And we've heard, of course, today already about Financing Nature, which was the result of a collaboration between teams at the Nature Conservancy and Cornell University, working also with the Paulson Institute, which was launched, just over a year ago now. And of course, some of the estimations made in that Financing Nature report have also made it into the Little Book of Investing in Nature, which is another Global Canopy book, part of their Little Book series that was launched just a bit earlier this year. Of course, I want to draw your attention to the State of Finance for Nature, a UNEP report done in collaboration with a couple of other organizations. And then crucially, there's the work of the OECD, particularly on harmful subsidies, that has attracted, deservedly, quite a lot of attention. So, okay, so the question or questions are, first, how are some of these estimates similar to each other and how are they different? And if there are indeed differences in the estimates, why are they different? And actually, do we have reason to be worried about the fact that there are differences? What do those numerical differences tell us about the reliability of these various estimates? Are they numbers that are ones that we can rely on for policy purposes? Well, the first thing I want to point out is that each of the different estimates that we've talked about today, some of which we have not had a chance to talk about today, but that are out there, I've alluded to a couple of them already, they address different questions and, of course, apply different methods in order to arrive at those estimates. So none of these various estimates, and it's important that we keep in mind when looking at them, none of them are quite comparable with each other because, again, the questions that they're looking to address can be slightly different, and in some cases, substantially different. I've mentioned the State of Finance for Nature report of the UNEP. They take a very comprehensive look at the funding required, but for one thing, nature-based solutions. While the Financing Nature study of the Nature Conservancy, Cornell, and Paulson comes from a very different place, looking at a more comprehensive set of expenditures to address the sustainability in many different forms of economic activity. And of course, the report that we're talking about today looks at addressing sort of rather comprehensive funding needs, although it presents 3 different and increasingly aggressive or bullish scenarios in terms of conservation, which makes even those numbers difficult to compare without reference to the underlying assumptions. Another really important observation that I want to bring up is that any estimate has some unknowns that are very difficult to put your finger on. And this was highlighted in the TNC Cornell Paulson report. And what I'm referring to is the potential cost, both in terms of direct costs, but also in terms of foregone revenue, of reducing biodiversity negative impacts of corporate activity. Those of you who have looked carefully at the TNC Cornell Paulson report may have noticed that this investment risk management, as it is called in that report, is the one category of expenditure that is blank and for which no estimate is provided, because the group that worked on the report felt that there were too many open questions, and the sort of range of possibilities was such that any estimate would be really a little more than a guess. And the reason this amount, what is referred to as investment risk management in this financing nature report, is so important is because similarly with harmful subsidies, in the case of investment risk management, the lower the biodiversity negative expenditures, the lower the amount that will have to be spent on biodiversity positive activities later in order to restore or repair nature. So any $1 that is not spent on these biodiversity negative forms of corporate activity may translate into an additional $1 that has to be spent later, or maybe multiples thereof that will have to be spent later in order to undertake restoration activities. So the amount of uncertainty that economic activity brings to the discussion is important. Given all of this, I actually think it's rather remarkable that the estimates that we've seen today and in some of the other reports that we've talked about are actually not more different in magnitude than they are, given the differences in the methods used and the underlying assumptions. Of course, this is qualified by the fact that a lot of the numbers that go into some of these estimates that we have seen or that we have used have actually been adopted after their publication by subsequent studies. So to some extent, there is a bit of recycling of information of certain categories or certain line items that ultimately are going to feed into the final estimates that would probably reduce the differences that you might otherwise expect to see. How important that that effect is, I suspect it is noticeable but not dramatic. So given the actual similarities and the relatively, all things considered, narrow range in my view of the various estimates of expenditures needed to fund the solutions to the biodiversity crisis, I think that tells us something about the reliability of some of the estimates out there. and the strength of the methodologies that were used. But importantly, when looking at any one of these numbers that, especially if we look at the media, tend to be thrown out and used without any reference to, okay, but what is that number about? What are the underlying assumptions, and how was that number calculated? That sort of takes a little bit away from the number, in the sense that it doesn't tell you what it is that amount that is being suggested is ultimately going to fund. But I suppose you can't really expect every news item in the media to go into a detailed explanation of what it is that is going to be addressed in terms of expenditures by each one of those estimates. So let me stop there for now, and I hope we get a chance to return to some of these issues later on in the discussion.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Professor Tobin, for these insights and for these comments. And you made an important point. I mean, linking the financial needs to the fact that, in fact, we do have many expenditures in the business as usual scenario that are actually harmful for biodiversity and that we need to address from the policy perspective. I think that's a nice segue into the comments from the panel on how this particular report is positioned in their overall work. I'll hand over to Jeremy to talk also on behalf of the entire panel. So Jeremy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time of day it is to everybody. I'm pleased to see almost 200 participants in today's webinar. I'm very glad that so many people have been able to join us. I'm going to speak on behalf of the whole panel. My colleague Tracy Cumming is also online, I know, but she's got some very other important maternal duties that she's undertaking with a young baby at the moment. So we've agreed that I will say a few words on behalf of us all, but Tracy is there, and if I get it wrong, she'll be quick to jump in, I'm sure. I think you all know pretty well what the panel's been trying to do over what feels like quite an extended period of time. I think it feels like an extended period of time for all of us involved in the CBD, and we know the reasons for that, and the pandemic has not helped. But we were asked back at COP14, as has been referred to earlier, to look at three things really. First of all, to produce a report reviewing the experience and to evaluate the strategy for resource mobilization that applied in the previous decade in the period from 2011 to 2020. And that was the first report which looked backwards, looked at the success or lack of success in achieving the goals set out in that strategy and in the targets that were associated with it. Secondly, the report that Yasha has just briefed us all on, and I think now I hope will be much clearer to you in terms of what it was trying to do and how it has drawn together as much of the available evidence and data as possible to try and make an estimate of the kind of resources that will be needed to secure funding for implementation of an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. But as we all know, that framework is not yet finalized, agreed, and so it is inevitably not something that can be pinned down precisely. So I think it's very helpful, I hope you agree, that that report of Yasha's has a range of figures in there. But as John has just said, they are all surprisingly similar and in a similar ballpark. So we're in the right order of magnitude, at least. And thirdly, the panel produced a report, I think perhaps most important from a policy point of view, about the components on resource mobilization that could figure in the global biodiversity framework, and I should say in any associated new strategy or in decisions of the COP about the resource mobilization issue. The only other thing I wanted to mention at this point, and I will say a few words about that report because it has some important components in it, is that there was a discussion last week, another webinar, another workshop organized by the Secretariat, but it was really about aligning financial flows with the needs of biodiversity protection and restoration, i.e. the objectives of the convention. And I think, in a sense, that resource mobilization and alignment of financial flows broadly, public and private, are two sides of the same coin. And just one figure, one set of figures that is perhaps worth keeping in mind, and are not always forming part of our discussions, and I'll be honest, don't actually form a big part of our reports as the panel, but the fact that the global capital markets are something like $350 trillion, that sovereign debt or capital debt is something like $277 trillion, that the post-COVID stimulus campaigns and funding were perhaps in the order of 10 or 12 trillion dollars. And we're talking here about biodiversity finance at the moment of the order of $100 billion. So that's important perspective, I think, to have on this, and one that I think, as we think about resource mobilization, we think about alignment, is a useful context for thinking about how much are we actually asking to protect the planet's biodiversity. It's relatively small compared with the huge amounts of money that flow around in public and private sector flows globally. So the panel of experts' conclusions in our third report, I think, are just worth a moment of mention again, and then I will finish and allow a discussion, because I think it'd be very interesting to hear reactions and have that discussion. And our key message is that in order to have a transformative, inclusive and equitable change of the kind that the Global Biodiversity Framework is seeking, we really needed to have three components when thinking about resource mobilization. First of all, redirecting and reducing resources that are causing harm to biodiversity. These can be from public expenditure, they can be from development finance, they can be from subsidies, they can be actions of the business sector. But reducing that is a vital part of the equation. Secondly, it's important, and that's often the sole focus, but we think it shouldn't be the sole focus, to generate additional resources from all sources, public, private, domestic and international, to achieve all three objectives of the convention. And thirdly, we think it's vital that wherever the resources come from, however they're used, they need to be used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And we set out a whole range of suggestions about how each of those three pillars, if you like, of a future strategic approach could be achieved. That's mainly in the third report. And we've had considerable discussions on this already in some of the preliminary meetings that have taken place. But we hope that those recommendations, those suggestions, built on the evidence that we've seen described today and from the first report that we undertook, will be useful as parties go into what we all hope, I know, will be eventually some very productive negotiations towards COP15 and an eventual outcome that will actually help us to protect the vital biodiversity of our threatened planet. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now we are going to move into the question and answers, commenting part. And of course, we are going to hear first from the co-chairs of the post-2020 process. But I know that also we are running a bit late. And we do have a couple of commenters that already indicated their interest. So please, what I suggest for, if there is additional questions or comments, please put them either in the chat or in the questions. If it's a really short question, you can put it in the chat, in the questions. If it's a longer chat, a longer comment, then please put it in the chat. We are going to look at this and trying to respond. We give the floor back to the panelists to provide some answers, and we will try to capture those as well. But if not, we might come back to you in written form. So please, now we move to the co-chairs. My special welcome to them. And Basil, you want to start, given that you have your camera on? Please go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, that I was just getting ready. Francis, you wanna start?
Sorry, you have been given the floor. I wouldn't object to it, but let me just because we have only 5 minutes between the two of us, so I'll not take a lot of time. I need to use just about 2 minutes first to thank our experts and all those that have put so much effort and energy to have this work done. And we see very interesting figures coming through. And I think when we are talking about financing the framework, this is the kind of information that is needed. People really need to have the opportunity to look at some of these figures. So really, thank you so much. I've taken note of some of these very interesting figures that is now available. I've not yet had time to study this report, but from what I see, I've downloaded it here. It forms a very important and interesting reading. My comment will just rotate around two things. One is that when I look at the financing gap, what we need to implement this framework, you see that it is between 722 and 967 billion. And then the estimated financing gap is between nearly 600 billion to $823 billion annually. Now that in a way speaks so much to our target 18, I think, and 19. How are we going to move forward with our figures in those targets? And I think that is something that I think this work could help us discuss it better. Now the facts are there. So that is one area that I wanted to just hint on. Then the other one concerns protected areas. And I think the benefits that could arise from having protected areas, what it could generate is given the cost of managing the current protected areas and even the new ones, which of course has a lot of money needed, is also given. But I have to say that with protected areas, again, this will depend a lot on situation. Maybe it could be region by region or even country by country. You may find actually that the cost even of maintaining the current protected area system could even be high because there are challenges that differs from country to country. Some countries are grappling with how to actually ensure integrity of the existing protected area system. And then for the new ones, those compensation, you look at the livelihood options that are there and the people's maybe issues of land and things like where are those people going to go? If it is land, if you compensate, where does the person go? Some places you may find land is no longer even available much when we are talking about, you know, compensating actually those that may have settled somewhere and they have to go somewhere else. So those are the other things we need to think about. But because we have less time, I think I will hand over to co-chair, but I'll be interesting myself to read how much it goes also to issues like restoration and so forth in the report. So Basil, over to you.
Thank you. So I have 4 messages for you in 2 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. The first one is following Francis to thank you all. I'll take you back to a few months ago where Francis and I were wrangling our hands with the notion of financial reports that would be coming after the initial date for the COP. That's not going to happen. Not only have you various experts and panelists and information and institution provided us with your numbers in advance of the COP, but you've been able also to update them. So we are in a better position today to have an informed conversation than we ever been. Second message, I think it was Jeremy who talked about the significant difference in the resource invested and managed by financial institution versus what we spent by government. And I take you back to the workshop of last week with the financial sector and that notion of aligning all financial flow. So we have 2 sides of the same coin, no pun intended. And we need to evolve the discussion on the 2 sides at the same time. So making sure the investment is done the right way, not only in a way to avoid costs, but also to create positive results is going to be important. The third message is the one on that have been said by many, including John Tobin, on the notion that we're in the right ballpark, the right order of magnitude. This last report by the experts is going to be instrumental in adjusting the numbers in the targets and the frameworks, but they're not changing the logic of what we're trying to do. So I'm very, very pleased to do that. I'm also very pleased to see the amount of commitment already been done, and I know some are already working on tallying that up, and I'm looking forward to hear that. And then finally, about reducing negative issues and negative subsidies and negative investment, that is continuing to be a super important part, and that has been acknowledged elsewhere. You've seen the language on that at the climate COP26, which is basically fulfilling half of target 18. Now let's see if we cannot return the favor and address the other half and help them in the same way. So again, thank you again for that. This is going to be a super important piece of information for us. Back to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Basil. Thank you, Francis, for these comments. Let's now hear a couple of more before giving back to Yasser to perhaps and the panel and John to perhaps provide some feedback on that. Of course, as you mentioned, the issue of subsidies and subsidy reform is a major one. We already had a question in the question section on whether it's really realistic to expect that we can redirect 500 billion of subsidies. Perhaps let's hear a couple more voices. I would like to call on Luis de Sousa, who indicated interest to talk. Luis, I give you the floor now. I will unmute yourself, but you're also self-muted, so please. Please go ahead. You're unmuted now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, congratulations to the authors of the final report of the panel of experts. And as a negotiator from Brazil, we know that Brazil has been pretty vocal on the need to have a robust and ambitious resource mobilization component within the post-2020 GBF. Well, we understand the previous reports have demonstrated that international public finance for biodiversity, in particular multilateral flows, it still represents a significantly small fraction of overall financial flows for biodiversity. And at the same time, developing countries are the ones most in need of investment, as only 5% of total conservation spending is allocated to those countries. My question is, most estimates from the global reports that we have seen today do not address the specific needs of developing countries and their specific challenges to leverage additional resources. So what further steps are needed to overcome those knowledge gaps regarding the needs and challenges of developing countries? And how can we increase international public finance for developing countries on a transparent, predictable, and expeditious basis? Thank you very much, Marcus. I'm not sure if you can see me. I think my webcam is not working.
We couldn't see you, but I think we heard you very clearly, and your question is very well noted.
Thank you very much.
I will mute you now again to basically cut out the background noise. Perhaps let's hear another comment, and I would like to give the floor to Hélène Perrier. I'm just trying to find you in
Thank you, Marcus. I hope you can hear me now. I'm sure you can't see me, but I'm not sure how to put on the camera. I mean, go to webinar is a bit of a new tool to me, at least. But I mean, thanks a lot, and good time of the day to all. Thanks especially to the expert panel who did a really interesting job in trying to put together all these elements. I think I can say that since the beginning of our journey on resource mobilization, this work has been very useful for us as parties to prepare for COP15. And so I think, as Jeremy was indicating, what's interesting is to really show all the efforts that will be needed if we want really a broad and transformative resource mobilization component of the GBF. I think, as he was saying, and as just said by Basile, there is really this notion of alignment of financial flows with biodiversity objectives, and this importance of course generating positive resources both from domestic and international and public and private sources, but also all the work that we will need to do on eliminating harmful financial flows and increasing effectiveness. So that is certainly interesting, and we will clearly continue working on that basis. On I think this new report by the panel and those figures on funding needs, what's quite interesting looking at the overview by Yasha is indeed to see that, of course, I think we're seeing a number of differences in terms of the various figures amongst the various studies. But what's also interesting, as Basile was saying, is to see that in terms of orders of magnitude, we are not too far away. And so it sounds as an interesting basis to continue the work. As you can imagine now, really one of our main areas of interest is to try and compare the conclusions of the expert panel with the resource mobilization numerical values that we have in the draft GBF, and that includes, for example, the figures we have in milestone D1 and in targets 18 and 19. During the first part of the open-ended working group 3, as the UN in its member states, we welcome the idea of having numerical values, including for resource mobilization. We think it's important to have measurable and action-oriented targets. But clearly, we indicated that we would need a bit more time and analysis to assess those numerical values. So I think clearly we need clear justification for these numerical values. We need to be clear on the baseline and then on how to measure progress and have good indicators. And I think clearly here one of the conclusions is that more work will be needed on monitoring and methodologies. But I think overall, what I would be quite interested in is to hear the expert panel's views on these numerical values that we have in the first draft. I mean, for example, looking at the value in milestone D1, I mean, again, what I understand is that the expert panel concludes to slightly lower figures than what we see in the Paulson report, for example. And so it would be quite interesting to get, maybe a bit more information from the panel on how do they assess the numerical values in the first draft.
Thank you. And let's now hand back. I think your last question, Elaine, this is really kind of more like core assessment work, and Yasha would perhaps best be suited. Whereas the other question that we're hearing, what about the specific needs of developing countries, how to provide for financial resources and as opposed to kind of mobilize or identify resource needs, that's perhaps something for Jeremy to respond to. So Yasha, do you want to come first, and then Jeremy, and John, if you have anything to amend, please feel free to come in also. Yasha?
Thanks, Marcus. Let me talk a little bit about some of the comments, not just the last one, but I think one of the comments that Luis was making Brazil, he was talking about the specific needs and alignment and what do we need to do for that. And I think that in some sense that the report doesn't talk too much about that, but I think of course, and that means that more work needs to be done in that area. But I think also we spend a lot of work understanding what is the role of the GEF and the assessment of the GEF for the next cycle. And in my view, my personal view, I think that the GEF should play a bigger role in this alignment that we are talking about and the needs from specific needs from countries. Now I see that from the assessment, I see that the assessment is a very small portion of the resources needed for the ambition that we are looking at with the new framework, and the GEF or any fund that we are thinking about should play a bigger role in terms of alignment and how to distribute all resources and how to think in terms of what are the people that get the benefits and what are the people that assume the costs. Helene was talking about the differences and how these differences are not as big, and I agree that that these differences are not far away from one to another. Like the same what John said, our role in this work was not only to come up with figures, but also to compare them and to say something about them. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future we find that these figures are all these are even smaller than new figures that in terms of funding needs. Definitely more work needs to be done in understanding some areas that we haven't touched, like John said, investment risk management. There's nothing said about that, and not in their report, not in our report, and it's something that it's going to have an impact in the future. So definitely more work, but there's something that I definitely am sure about, like, and I'm sure, I know that you are sure about too, with all these numbers, is that if we don't find a way to have these resources and somehow, like John said, to reduce the subsidies and the report also mentions all the negative subsidies that have this negative impact, that it's not like we've been talking about how it's not one-to-one, but have a huge impact in biodiversity. The numbers that we will need in the next in the next framework, whatever it is, or when it's going to be much bigger. These are not big numbers compared to what we the way that I understand this is that if you look at the high-level panel report in if I'm not wrong, 2003, 2004, they came up with figures around 400 billion, and at that time those numbers were huge, and now we are talking about those numbers like it's something 10 years, 15 years later. We're talking about numbers that are not far and that are not far from those numbers. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we are talking about bigger numbers than those. Those are my main comments. I don't know if I'm missing something, but I'm gonna give the yeah.
Thanks, Yasha. John. And John, want to come in?
Well, actually, I wanted to make a comment on a slightly different issue, if that's all right, and it has to do with subsidies, because it's such a hugely important issue that has proved so far to be intractable. And as the OECD has done so very well, we recognize how important it can be not only to trade, etc., but to biodiversity protection. And I can just imagine some of my close collaborators right now probably rolling their eyes and thinking to themselves, okay, there's John again on subsidies. But I really do think that part of the problem has been the framing of the discussion, because a lot of the discussion of subsidies has come from a place of telling countries that they need to phase out subsidies. And I think that has been part of the reason that the discussion has not gone further than it has. I think the approach that we need to take to subsidies in order to have a more fruitful discussion is to come from either a more humble position or a position that is less about a commitment to open trade, and simply say or accept the fact that countries, jurisdictions may have perfectly good reasons that we do not understand and that are frankly not relevant to the discussion for having subsidy schemes in place. Certain groups within these nations have either because of the history of the country or what the country views as important jurisdictions or constituencies, I should say, have put in place these subsidies, and I don't think it is right for other countries to say phase them out, but rather, if what we're looking to is to have an impact on biodiversity, to frame it in terms of you have political reasons which we respect and which are not what we want to talk about now for having subsidies schemes in place. But one thing that we can say to you is that if you are choosing to support economically particular groups with subsidies to their economic activity, there are ways to do so in a manner that is much less impactful on biodiversity than some of the practices that you have required in order for those selected groups to receive those subsidies. So moving away from phase out subsidies to reforming subsidies such that whatever amounts countries decide to allocate, those amounts are spent in a way that is less destructive. That's all. And Jeremy, I think you were looking to jump in.
Briefly, I mean, I was asked a question as well, so let me just try and do that. I mean, but John, on your subsidies point, yes, you're right. You can nuance the language, but the reality is subsidies are deeply embedded in many parts of the globe, in the global economy. So it's clearly let's be honest, it's a controversial issue. It's a political issue. It was a political issue at COP26 on climate. I don't think we would be surprised if it was a political issue at COP15 on biodiversity. But if you don't address these political issues when we have such an important challenge ahead of us, that's ducking the question. So I think subsidies do have to be addressed, but it won't be done in the COP15 alone, because this is an area that goes much deeper into the whole of economic system. So, but it's a very important topic. No, I'm just going to come back to a point from Luis de Souza from Brazil, and apologies for the noisy drilling in the background here, that around to what extent we'd address developing country needs, particularly. Now, I mean, what you see in the various reports, Yasha, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, many of the reports are taking, as it were, a top-down approach, a macro approach, and then saying this is the global picture, whereas the Jeff Needs assessment is attempting to build it up from the bottom in a kind of bottom-up approach, so that you look at what individual countries are saying and then get the aggregate picture. And the Jeff Needs assessment you highlight as one of the areas that you've drawn on for our own assessment, the panel's own assessment of estimate of needs. So, it's true, the Jeff Needs assessment is one of those areas where we're looking directly at the needs of developing countries as recipients of Jeff funding under the financial mechanism of the convention. But in terms of other things that are going on that is relevant to the financing, NBSAPs, the work of BioFin, the strong suggestion from the panel for the need for a national biodiversity financing plan to go along with the NBSAP, these are all parts of our attention as a panel, I would suggest, Luis, to the needs of developing countries. They're actually needs of developed countries too, but they certainly address the needs of developing countries, and obviously the GEF does. And finally, on the GEF, Yasha, your point that the GEF is very, very small compared with these needs. Indeed, it is. But I think we see in the preparations for GEF 8, even ahead of our own contribution to it here, a real attention to the catalytic effect that the GEF can have, the enabling effect it can have to unlock both private finance, but wider policy reform, the mainstreaming agenda, if you like, and the significant resources that can be drawn in to support biodiversity for that. So it may be limited in what it has as a label on the ticket, biodiversity funding, but in terms of its enabling effect, it can be very, very powerful, even more so in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, John and Yasha. We do have a couple of minutes left, and there is a couple more colleagues waiting to provide comments. So I'd rather prefer, it will take more than the few minutes left, but I rather prefer to take 10 more minutes to go a bit over time, if that's agreeable with you. So let's have a second round. I see Georgia Pat, you want to come in? I unmute yourself, and I unmuted you. Georgia?
Hi,
Yeah.
sorry, Marcus. I believe it's actually my colleague Will Lockhart is going to say something.
Oh, okay. So then we will go to him. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Good day. How are you all? So I echo the comments from panelists previously. Thank you, so much to the expert panel for that absolutely fantastic afternoon of presentation, and also, of course, all their really hard work. I'll be very brief because we are running out of time. I think from the UK perspective, I'm Will Lockhart talking to you from the UK government today. I think from the UK perspective, we took two messages, I think, from the afternoon. I think the first message we took is quite a sobering one, which is that we have a huge amount of other work to do to harness the finance that's necessary to close the biodiversity financing gap. Of course, we are on the way, and we mustn't forget that. So in particular, of course, from the UK perspective, the nature finance outcomes at COP26, which I think reflect a real sort of global ambition to put nature and nature finance at the heart, of course, of the climate crisis, but also, of course, recognizing the inherent biodiversity crisis that confronts us. I think that we need to do a piece of work that thinks about bringing together all of those new financial commitments for nature finance and understanding what they mean for our ambition in the global biodiversity framework, how much new finance is actually out there, and where are the gaps, and how do we address those in the coming months. But of course, it's clear that we do have a huge amount of work more to do to drive the systemic shifts that we're going to need to see, if we are actually going to close the financing gap. And we've heard a lot about that, so I won't say too much more. I think the second thing we've heard from the UK is that it's critical that our deliberations are informed by the best evidence. We need our targets, in the framework to be specific, achievable, realistic, so that they drive the right actions, the right outcomes, so that they're properly tailored to the ambition level. So huge thanks to the panel. They've given us the best available evidence, but of course, what they haven't given us is the answer. There isn't an answer. There isn't a precise answer to how much we need to invest in nature. We've heard about estimates and ranges and uncertainties and methodologies. It's complex, and there's never going to be the right answer. But we shouldn't expect that of our experts, right? I mean, that's over to us as political operators and negotiators. And I think what they've given us is a very, very clear landing zone. They've given us a very clear range, and we've heard from a couple of speakers that range isn't as large as it might otherwise have been, and I think we really have our experts to thank for that. I guess the question for the experts is, I think, what happens in your view? What are the risks if as negotiators we take this information? Can we come to the wrong decision? What might the wrong decision look like to you, and what are the risks of us coming to the wrong decision on what to include in the framework itself? Thank you all.
That's a almost mean question to ask the panel of experts, but we will duly hear from them what they think. Thanks for this. We'll have two.
We cannot hear you, Marcus.
Sorry for that. I was saying, let's hear two more comments, quick comments before wrapping up. First, as Biofin was mentioned, Biofin want to also come in, Mariana, and then we hear Katja from OECD. Mariana, you have the floor. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, Marcus, I just want to highlight, I wrote it on the chat, that I think the work that Jasha did was a very complex one. When you try to bring down the numbers to the national level, it's a very different story than when you work with global numbers. And surprisingly, he had the same experience that we've had in Biofin when we've worked with our countries doing the finance needs assessment based on their MBSAPs. And the numbers come out pretty low or lower than expected. And the reason behind this is that maybe MBSAPs are not being ambitious enough in order to tackle the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. And I think this is a lesson, a very important lesson for the new global biodiversity framework, that if we manage to have a measurable framework with clear targets and indicators, it'll be easier for countries to develop a more comprehensive MBSAP, working also in the productive sectors like Jasha mentioned, and this will reflect in their finance needs assessment and their biodiversity finance plan. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana, for this point. And in fact, I mean, the NBSAP analysis in the report is also bottom-up analysis reflecting needs of developing countries, or also of developing countries. But of course, I mean, there is limitations, as you mentioned. Katja, you want to come in?
Sure. Thank you very much, Marcus, and thank you very much to the authors of the report. I have maybe a couple of comments, and I also want to talk a little bit about subsidies as well, given that the OECD work has been mentioned a number of times. First of all, I mean, in terms of the estimates, I'm nearly surprised by how similar they are, actually, given how different the scope of the studies are. If you look across the 3 studies, one is looking at protected areas. The one by John Tobin et al. Basically is looking across the entire gamut of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And the other one looks across the 3 conventions, focusing only on nature-based solutions. So yeah, different scopes across 3 different studies. Also to say perhaps that I'm sort of curious about the use of compensation costs versus opportunity costs. I think the literature generally refers to opportunity costs, and whether actually all the studies did the same thing when they're talking about compensation versus opportunity costs. But I did want to also come back to the discussion on subsidies. I'd like to highlight that some OECD work is referred to there, but we do have updates of that work. It's a 2020 report on a comprehensive overview of global biodiversity finance. And also released this year is a report, Biodiversity, Natural Capital and the Economy, also looking at the harmful support. And what I'd like to be clear on is that our estimates, which are actually based on available data, it's data reported to the OECD by a number of countries, not only OECD countries, doesn't only cover subsidies, it also covers in certain fields, for example, market price support. So we use the term government support to agriculture, for example. We have the different databases, but it goes beyond subsidies. And so it's not only about budgetary transfers. So for example, the 500 billion estimate, you couldn't just take, it's not a clump of money that you can just take and redirect all of it to something else. The other thing, a message I'd like to point across is that, I mean, it's really great. I think in Aichi Target 3, we had a good balance in my view of both the need to reform harmful incentives, including subsidies to biodiversity. And by reforming these harmful incentives and subsidies, basically, because biodiversity in so many cases is a public good, you're getting the price in a sense to zero, actually, because right now we're overstimulating biodiversity use. And so in order to truly reflect the value of biodiversity in economic decision-making, not only do you need to reform these harmful incentives, including subsidies, but you also need to adequately reflect them in market prices. And the way to do that is through economic instruments, price-based instruments, quantity-based instruments, such as taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits. These are all things that are lead to the sort of the polluter pays principle. So when we look at target 18, right now, the proposed wording, while there's strong emphasis on the need to reform these harmful incentives, including subsidies, the flip side of the coin, where the language just says to remain neutral or positive, is really not a sufficiently clear signal on reflecting the true value of biodiversity in everyday decision making. So if we really want to mainstream, we need both sides, to reform the harmful incentives and the subsidies, and on the other side, put policy instruments in place, the economic instruments or the positive incentives that will adequately reflect the use of biodiversity in our everyday decision making. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Katja, for this enriching the discussion further. Now we are really as I said, we are already in overtime. So I would like to give back to the panel very quickly to give a very specific reaction to the question on the risk for negotiators. What could be the wrong decision? Jeremy, you want perhaps to have a stab first?
I'll have a stab, and thanks to the joys of WhatsApp, we have a consolidated panel position on this. No, seriously, we have been able to, and actually we all came up with the same answer at the same time. And our answer is that the wrong decision would be a decision that was too narrowly focused. It would be a decision where, for whatever reason, in the negotiations, the eventual outcome was that too much attention or sole attention was given to one aspect of what we've tried to say is a multifaceted problem and solutions at the expense of the others. So, for instance, if all the attention was devoted to finalizing as ambitious a figure as possible, for instance, on international financial flows, at the expense of sufficient attention and ambition on the other aspects, such as Katja has just been referring to, reducing harmful subsidies, building positive incentives into the economic system, and indeed on our third pillar of looking at the efficiency with how resources are used, if there was a diversion to one aspect of that, we think that would be a really lost opportunity, because we genuinely believe that all three need to go hand in hand, and that only by addressing all three effectively in the negotiations and the eventual outcomes will we get the most robust and effective resource mobilization approach to deliver the GBF. So that would be our answer. It's not about a particular number. It's not this one is too high, that one is too low. That is for the negotiators to discuss, but it would be narrowing the focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think that was almost closing remarks. Let me quickly add from my side, I mean, from a really top level, I think there's no really takeaway lessons because the discussion is ongoing. But what I see perhaps as main outcome of our discussion today, first, there seems to be understanding that the funds need to increase. There is difference in the estimates. The estimates can be pretty well, the difference can be pretty well explained by the different methodologies, the different assumptions. The ballparks are all pretty similar. That's one. Funding needs to increase significantly. There is then second a major attention, of course, to the whole notion of mainstreaming aligned financial flows, reforming harmful subsidies. That's a major bulk of the discussion, and we need to take action on that. But there is third, of course, an ongoing and urgent need to look at particular for new and additional resources for specifically developing countries. And that is one element that is part also of the architecture proposed by the panel. And that remains to be firmly on the agenda. So with that, perhaps let's close for now. I thank you all for your attention. I thank the panel of experts. I thank John Tobin for providing his basically additional perspective from one of the let's say main processes on funding needs assessment. My thanks also to the co-chairs to provide their perspective, to the SBI chair for her opening remarks. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for your patience, given that we are now 10 minutes over time, and we call it a day for now. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, Marcus. And just to say that they're going to share the presentation on this webinar online.
Oh yes, perhaps in terms of housekeeping, I should mention, yes, we will present that on the meeting site. Also, there was an issue, there was a question on where is the references to the different reports, and I should mention that these are referenced in the report of the expert panel. So if you need the source, then you will find it there.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.